For joining us for what will be an interesting session discussing the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, which is being hosted by the Jewish Independent. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Huppert and I will be moderating this evening's session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which you are all participating in this event. I'm on the land of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. Jewish Australians and Australian First Nations people have often worked together to uphold truth-telling, justice and human rights. And tonight we are exploring whether the Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion will bring truth-telling, justice and human rights for the Jewish community. To introduce our panellists. Simone Abel is the Head of Legal at the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. Simone is a human rights lawyer. Prior to working on legal responses to combat anti-Semitism, Simone's career focused on assisting those who experienced extreme rights abuses and engaging in advocacy and policy work to challenge rights violations. Dr. Jeremie Bracka is an Australian-Israeli human rights law academic based at RMIT's University School of Law. His research lies at the intersection of transitional justice, constitutional law, and international human rights. Jeremie's work explores Truth Commission's legal responses to historical injustice with a focus on Israel-Palestine and Indigenous justice in Australia. Dean Sherr is a political and communications professional with experience in government, politics, and community activism. Now working at business consulting firm Horizontis, Dean has worked as a media advisor to Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, as well as in the offices of former Victorian Minister Philip Dallidakis and federal member Josh Burns. Dean has also held leadership roles within a number of Jewish community organisations and is currently a member of the Jewish Climate Network Board. I will be asking each of the panellists 2 questions and then give them the opportunity to respond to the other panellists, following which hopefully we'll have some time for questions. We've already received some questions, but if you have anything else you would like to ask, please submit questions via the Q&A function, and we will endeavour to get to them. Now over to our panellists, and my first question is for Jeremie. With your background in constitutional law, can you please provide an overview as to how you anticipate the Royal Commission will operate, what powers it has?
Of course, one would think after so many years on Zoom, I would know to unmute. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and opportunity to speak to the Royal Commission and perhaps shed some light and provide some clarity to many people out there who are trying to follow this response and kind of decipher what in fact is going to be achievable and what in fact is sort of political rhetoric. And I think a lot of people in the community are rightfully a little bit confused, but also a little bit cynical, as one would expect after 2.5 years of the scale and trauma of anti-Semitism. So let me start with this by saying, and forgive me for being a lawyer and telling you what the Royal Commission is not, but it is not a court. But at the same time, a Royal Commission is in fact the most powerful public inquiry mechanism that we have under Australian law. Royal Commissions are established under the Royal Commission Act from 1902, and they get their authority, and this is really important, from the executive, not from the judiciary. What that means is that Royal Commissions make recommendations. They don't determine criminal guilt. So they can investigate in ways that are often much more far-reaching than ordinary legal processes, and I think that's really important. If I was just to talk a little bit more specifically about this Royal Commission into Anti-Semitism and Social Cohesion, what we have is an incredibly ambitious project by any stretch of the imagination. It is a very tightly framed inquiry. The letters patent of the Commission makes it clear that its focus is on anti-Semitism, particularly in the wake of the 7th of October and the Bondi attack, and on the impact generally of Jewish Australians' safety, well-being and daily life. But the focus is also, and I think this is really important, on the adequacy of law enforcement. and security responses and gaps in legal frameworks. And I think this is where the Royal Commission has an opportunity to do some really hard yards and perhaps deliver on um, needs that the Jewish community has had and been raising since October 7th in earnest. Um, What's also really important to note about this particular Royal Commission in the context of anti-Semitism is that it adopts the IRA, the International Holocaust uh, uh, Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And I think that is really important because it's likely to shape how evidence is interpreted. And I might say a bit more about that later. Now, the title does refer to social cohesion, but I'm pleased to say that Commissioner Virginia Bell, in her opening remarks, made it super clear that the focus of this inquiry is on the Jewish community. And I think that's really important. It's particularly important given the recent events of the Sydney Swans, where I think we need, as a society, to not shy away from calling out who, in fact, are the targets of Bondi and of the rise in hate, and it is the Jewish community, and we need to be able to stand behind a legal body that is embarking on a journey to uncover those fact findings, especially by naming what in fact the harm is that we're looking at. What the Royal Commission is not is a broad social inquiry in the abstract. It's a targeted response to anti-Semitism. It does have a little focus um, in terms of its preventative orientation. It's looking at de-radicalization. Obviously, we do have that word social cohesion, but it's kind of interested also in what brought us to what has been described by recently a genocide scholar as a mini genocide that we saw in Australia on Bondi Beach. Um, if I could just say a little bit about the powers of the Royal Commission, they're very coercive in the sense that they can actually require people to participate. So, what that would mean is that the Commission could summon a wide range of witnesses, senior police involved in responding to Bondi, threats to synagogues since October the 7th, intelligent officials explaining what was known beforehand. Clearly, I mean, there was obviously a failure of intelligence. So this commission does have, it's not just a toothless tiger, it does actually have powers to bring decision makers and senior members of ASIO to the box, to the witness box to answer questions. What also, at least in my context as an academic, is that the commission can also bring university leaders, vice chancellors, where anti-Semitism has occurred on campus, social media companies, protest organisers, and of course, even ministers and senior bureaucrats. And they have to answer questions under oath. This isn't optional. It's not the National Forum or Four Corners. It is an actual opportunity for decision makers at the top to take responsibility. And what it also can do is can compel documents, and that's really important. A Royal Commission, in our case, importantly for this context, can demand internal police briefings about threats to Jewish events, intelligence assessments. Why was there? It seems to be such a paucity of police there on that night. Extremist actors, all other documents that might give us some understanding or shed some light on how complaints were handled about anti-Semitism after October the 7th, including university incident reports. So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that the Royal Commission can't reconstruct the events, but it can certainly give us a greater picture of what, when, and where the failures were preventable. And those powers are, in fact, backed by law. Just very quickly just forgive me if I'm speaking too long, but how the Commission will operate, it will hold both public hearings, private sessions as well. We've seen that in other Royal Commissions. Private sessions might be used for more vulnerable witnesses. The timeline is really tight. So we're not talking, the Europe Justice Commission, Victoria was also had Royal Commission powers. It took 4 years. We are looking for an interim report due on the 30th of April. That's basically tomorrow. And Virginia Bell has indicated that she's going to be committing to that 14th of December deadline for a final report. That is a very compressed time frame. It means that recommendations might not be as far-reaching as we might like. And The other constraint, of course, that Virginia Bell made in her opening remarks is that nothing in the inquiry can prejudice the criminal proceedings against the alleged attackers. And in practical terms, as someone who's looked at truth commissions, that does pose a kind of a danger in that we might be limited to the extent of to which how much we could hear from survivors or affected community members, given that the evidence in open hearings is ongoing, and prosecutions are on foot. And my view is that might diminish some of the truth-telling capacity of this commission, because there really is a real tension between the commission's traditional role as a forum for public testimony, but also this need to preserve fair trials. I will just say also in terms of how it's going to operate is that we are, I think, fortunate that the seven sort of big rooftop bodies, including the Zionist Federation and ECAJ in Sydney, are all being represented by Anna Bloch-Liebler in coordinating their submissions to the Commission. And I think that will be important to see that the representation of Jewish organisations that are, in fact, representative of the community are well-resourced and their submissions are made in ways which to influence and inform the Commissioner's findings. I'll just say one other thing and then I'll wrap up, and that is just to say that Royal Commissions sit somewhere between a legal inquiry and truth-telling. And they can be legalistic, they can be time limited, they might not produce the community healing that the Jewish community might be after. So it's important for us to already perhaps calibrate our expectations. But I think if you can picture this, a royal commission into anti-Semitism that brings a police commissioner or a university vice chancellor or a government minister into a witness box and requires them to produce internal documents and then is asked under oath, what did you know? What did you do? More importantly, what did you not do? And what could you have done better to protect Jewish Australians? I think we have an opportunity, and I think that we're very lucky that we have this response.
Thanks, Jeremie, for that really broad overview about the Royal Commission and how it's going to operate. Dean, perhaps you could expand on how we got to this position, the drivers behind the establishment of the Royal Commission, just to put us in a bit of context politically.
Sure. So, look, I think it's obviously been a big process, and there was a lot of public discussion about whether it was the right approach, and everyone would obviously remember that in the weeks after Bondi, the government's initial response was to resist calling a royal commission, and I think there's probably a few reasons for that. First of all, politicians are stubborn, and sometimes they want to come to a quick response and stick to it. And politicians don't like, and this is true for all of them really, they don't like to admit that they were wrong, or to at least to change their approach in such a way that contradicts something that they've previously said. So I think that it was a bit of obviously it was a battle, and the Jewish community, together with many other community groups, leaders across the community, ran a big campaign on it. And I think it was quite significant that the Prime Minister decided to, I suppose, concede the point and change his position on it. I think understanding how the government's tried to respond to particular issues or incidents of anti-Semitism over the last couple of years, particularly before Bondi, is sort of instructive as well, because I think, and people will obviously have their criticisms, I think one of their approaches has been, when you have a serious incident, to sort of respond in some way sort of quickly. And you can go back to, for example, the big doxing scandal. They announced that they'd implement some anti-doxing laws. They condemned it, and then they sort of wanted to, let that legislation sit, prepare it, put it through the parliament, and see how it comes into action. So I think particularly after a big tragedy like Bondi, they wanted to make some quick announcements, to meet with the community, obviously respond to things like security funding needs, and obviously to show that understanding, but that they didn't necessarily want to put forward a process that would take a long time, which royal commissions do, and that would sort of outsource responsibility. And if you look at historically, royal commissions that have been called there's kind of two politically, there's almost two kinds of royal commissions generally. One is when a government thinks it's sort of advantageous for them politically to inquire into a scandal or a failure, usually one that's happened under the watch of the previous government. And you can think of the Abbott government calling a royal commission into trade union corruption. You can think of the Albanese government calling one into the robo-debt scandal. And then there's ones that are sort of a big national scandal that has to be really looked at comprehensively. And you think more like the Morrison government calling one into aged care abuse, or even going back in time to the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. So I think, the sort of downside is you can call a Royal Commission, the government outsources responsibility at that point, it becomes independent, it becomes fully within the purview of the commissioner that they appoint within the terms of reference that they set. And then sometimes you will have that criticism that, and I think Scott Morrison's just as an example, he called a lot of Royal Commissions, and sometimes that's actually a way to alleviate pressure on a government, put it into an independent process that usually takes a couple of years. As Jeremie said, this one's a very short time frame, less than a year. So, but sometimes the criticism will be, well, you've sort of called a Royal Commission and now you don't have to do anything until the recommendations come back. And then that takes time too. So I think people will have a lot of people will have a more cynical view of why the government resisted calling a Royal Commission early on. There are probably some reasonable factors that went into that initial decision, but at the same time, as Jeremie said, Royal Commissions are the biggest sort of form of public inquiry that we have in this country, and it's what we call into the biggest scandals, the biggest tragedies, and this clearly both the Bondi attack itself, one of the worst terrorist attacks, the worst terrorist attack on Australian soil in history, but also one of the worst anti-Semitic terror attacks in global history, particularly in the diaspora. And the broader anti-Semitism that's been raging through the country since October 7, clearly it was sort of warranted. And so I think the government obviously eventually listened, and it's credit to everyone who campaigned for it. And now we have this, as Jeremie said, opportunity to be heard.
Thanks, Dean. Simone, you work for the ECAJ, the roof body of the Australian Jewish community. How is the organised Jewish community approaching the Royal Commission? And are our community organisations doing enough to reach different parts of our community and communicate with those parts of the community that everybody has something to say and a right to give a submission?
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I would just like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging on Gadigal land. So I know that it's been a slightly painstaking process and that many people in the community are very eager to learn more and to participate. And we hope that people will indeed participate. And I'll talk to you about how. I guess one of the main takeaways I would really like to give anyone watching this is to go online and to look. There's a website called shareyourstory.org.au. And this is an initiative that you can trust and be confident in. It's something that we, as a collective, so the 8 organizations that Jeremie mentioned, have all got together, and we're all utilizing this organization. And what it does is it provides support for making a submission. It's really a great place for troubleshooting, and it will help also triage inquiries from the community. Some people, for example, may have an active complaint in their workplace around anti-Semitism, and they may have genuine concerns about whether or not they can actually make a submission about the conduct that they've experienced, and it may have implications for the status of their legal matter. So those are the kinds of questions we're getting a lot of. What about somebody who's experienced anti-Semitic conduct at university and they fear reprisals from their professor if they, provide a public submission. And so this is really a go-to place, and it has the advantage of being really impartial as well. So obviously we as organizations cannot in any way influence people's submissions. It's really important that people use their own voice and speak about their authentic experiences of anti-Semitism. And this is a really good way to do that. And I think one of the things about it as well is it really encourages everybody to think about this, as a story. I think the word submission has been a bit daunting for some people. And at the end of the day, what's important is that the Royal Commission has a very good oversight of the state of play in this country around anti-Semitism, the depth of it, where it's reached, what sectors it's reached into, what it looks like in those different sectors, and what the institutional responses have or haven't been. And the only way that the Royal Commission can actually get that understanding is if people come forward and they share their experiences. And it needn't be lengthy. You can just prepare some bullet points. It's not a legal document in the same way as, if you were preparing an affidavit for court. It's just important that you tell the truth and you speak to your experience, and you will have the option. You can either elect to provide an anonymous submission, which means that the Commission won't be able to make contact with you. They won't know anything about your identity. The obvious disadvantage to that is that if they need further information, they won't be able to get it. Alternatively, you could make a submission in a confidential capacity. So in other words, you could provide your personal information, your name, etc., your experiences, anyone who engaged in anti-Semitic conduct towards you to the Royal Commission, and you could, select confidentiality for that. And the other alternative, obviously, is to make a public submission, which our organisations will be doing. So there's a group of us, and we're very fortunate to have pro bono legal representation from ABL, and we have a team of counsel who are assisting us, and we'll all be making submissions on different areas of focus. And then, of course, doing everything we can to encourage not just individuals from the community, but also our organisations under our respective umbrellas to make their submissions and to add their own authentic voice. And I guess the other thing I just wanted to say is you don't need to be Jewish to make a submission. So it's really important that members of the public who have witnessed anti-Semitic conduct also come forward and make submissions. I think that would be really powerful and helpful for our community. And over recent weeks, a lot of people have come up to me and said, look, what can I do to support the community? I know that you guys are experiencing a lot of pain, and it's been a difficult few years. And the answer really is to make a submission. I think that could be really impactful.
Thank you very much, Simone. And for those who are interested, the website that Simone mentioned, Share Your Story, the web address is in the chat, so you can access it that way.
Exactly. And sorry, one more thing is also if people need support, there's a fantastic organization that provides legal advice, which Share Your Story is also doing referrals to, called Jewish Center for Law and Justice. We work very closely with them, and they are gearing up to provide legal support for people who have legal questions. And also you'll find resources on the ECAJ website, so ecaj.org.au. There's some videos, and there's guidance about how to make a submission as well.
Thanks, Simone. I think that was all very useful and practical information. Jeremie, a lot of people talk about anti-Semitism hiding as anti-Zionism. In light of the recent decision of the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal in Vorkheimer and Taya, which turned on the use of the phrase all Zionists are terrorists, how might the distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism play out at the Royal Commission?
Yes, this is an area that I'm incredibly interested in, and I'm working on legal scholarship in addressing these very thorny questions. I think the starting point is this, and I think it's very sensible, and I think everyone in the Jewish community would understand this. Well, everyone, but certainly most, would understand that legally speaking, criticism of Israel or Zionism as an ideology is not in of itself unlawful or anti-Semitic. Australian law has been incredibly careful to protect political communication, constitutionally as well. And so obviously, robust critique of states, ideologies, opposition to wars, that is all fair game. The difficulty is that the line is not drawn in the abstract, but in context. So when you are targeting individuals or calling for violence directed against groups or eliminationist rhetoric in certain contexts, that is when the line is crossed. And I'll say a little bit more about the particular, what I would say, bright line drawn by the VCAT decision most recently. But the same language that is framed as political speech in one setting can often be hate speech and group-based hostility in another. Now, what I think is important to note, and this is really relevant to the Royal Commission, is that the VCAT decision of Vorsheimer and Taya, where the Judge Tran made it abundantly clear that when you say all Zionist terrorists, that is a breach and that is hate speech and that is vilification. The actual leading authority at the federal level is in fact Wertheim and Haddad. And there, Justice Stewart made a distinction where he recognized that the preacher Haddad made clearly anti-Semitic claims that did breach the 18C of the Act, when he said things like Jews were filthy and all sorts of other things that were clearly anti-Semitic. But he did make a distinction for remarks that the preacher made about Israel and Zionists and said that they were protected political commentary. Now, in my view, while I can appreciate the legal necessity to safeguard political speech, this approach was an incredibly semantical and technical one that didn't actually apply the law correctly. The law requires how that language would land with the protected community. And Justice Stewart did not do that very well in his judgment, because we know as members of the Jewish community that the word Zionist, even when it's claimed to be used ideologically or in the political abstract, is often one that operates as a proxy for Jews, particularly in charged environments, and particularly in the case of Worsheim in VCAT, where it's accompanied by placards that demonize Jews, that have references to the Holocaust. So context is king. And the recent VCAT decision, even though it's, to be clear, it's a tribunal decision, it's not the federal court, it did not make that distinction. It, in fact, made it very clear that language needs to be understood in context and how it operates in practice. And let's just be clear on this in terms of Justice Stewart's distinction that I would say is a terrible legal misstep in Wertheim and Haddad. There are very credible reports that Naveed Akram was a follower of that preacher. Now, hate speech is clearly not a theoretical discussion anymore after Bondi, right? These words, this language has real life consequences that our community has paid for with our lives. So the court and the Royal Commission has an opportunity to draw this line more clearly. And I think that it has the ability to do so, particularly when it is now including the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which will help guide the Commission to move beyond the more rigid formalistic approach in Wertheim and Haddad, because it will be able to recognize that clearly certain forms of delegitimizing a collective about Israel and Zionism in context can be anti-Semitic, and perhaps will support recommendations that are much closer to the contextual reasoning in Vorsheimer. So I think that this distinction is likely to play out and be central to the Commission. Clearly, there'll be some strong arguments about protecting political speech, which I might add as a constitutional law lecturer, I'm very much in favour of. Our beef is not with political criticism or ideological disputes. It's with targeting individuals and using violent rhetoric. And when Zionists, in the context of the hate speech, or is code or clearly a substitute for the word Jew. particularly when it's linked to exclusion, intimidation, and violence.
Thank you, Jeremie. That's a really, I think, has helped everybody see how this may play out and the legal distinction, as opposed to how we in the community experience the distinction or lack of distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. I'm just going to switch the order around a bit and ask Simone a question. I wonder if you could talk a bit about how the community hopes for the outcomes of the Royal Commission, and where the community hopes that this will play out in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I should also say I think it's worth looking at the Kostakidis kind of interim decision that came after the Wertheim and Haddad one, because I think what that does is it actually elaborates on the Haddad decision, and I think it clarifies what is a common misconception that we hear in our community, that in fact it's not the case under our racial vilification laws, that anti-Zionism can never be hate speech, can never be racial vilification. So I think there's certainly an opening there, and I agree that that would obviously be something that we would want to have more clarity around. But I think that we're on solid ground there, and hopefully we can build on that now as well, following the Borsheimer and Teyer judgment. In terms of what we're looking to come out of this, I agree with everything that's been said so far by the panelists, in the sense that this is a very focused Royal Commission. It has a short time frame. I think what we're hoping for are very practical recommendations that could be implemented. The good news is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. I mean, there are literally reams of recommendations that have been made by the Jewish community over the past several years, but particularly over the last 2.5+ years. The pace of legislative change and reform has been really significant over the last 1.5 years or so since I joined the ECAJ. I mean, in the last few weeks, we've participated in a parliamentary inquiry, I think every single week. So what's been frustrating is that we haven't still got to the place where we want to go, but we know where we want to go. So, for example, for a long time, the Jewish community has been asking for a promotion of hatred offence. And unfortunately, as many of you will know, the Combating Anti-Semitism bill that was put forward in the wake of the Bondi anti-Semitic terrorist attack ended up having the serious vilification provision excised from it, which from our perspective was a real shame. I mean, it was not a perfect provision. It had some serious shortcomings, but what we were looking for was something that would be more readily usable in the real world, in a world of online hate and in a world where we see people promoting hatred through their conduct, but not explicitly inciting others to carry out acts, because as we all know, extremist organizations just don't work that way. And Haddad's a prime example of this. He instilled a particular, religious ideology in his followers, and he didn't overtly perhaps tell them what conduct to carry out, but there was a clear road from the hateful words that we've seen over recent years to, unfortunately, what happened at Bondi. So we'll certainly be looking for more reform in that area. I think that there are certain sectors that we all know we would like to see substantial reform in, from the university sector, for example, to schools, the online space as well. So we've made recommendations previously in previous inquiries around online reform, including, for example, a much more comprehensive regime with a duty of care that's imposed on social media platforms. We would like to see regulation of AI and algorithms to promote, more, I suppose, informed and less hateful communications online. At the moment, there's a lot of what we would call pile-ons online, and unfortunately, we have a lot of anti-Semitic echo chambers because of the lacuna in the online safety framework. And of course, for our community, misinformation and disinformation are serious issues. Obviously, we need to protect freedom of speech, and that needs to be given wide berth. But there were attempts in recent times to create legislation that operated in this space, and that failed. So, there's a whole host of different areas. And then, of course, extremism, terrorism. We just made an appearance before an inquiry where the monitor was considering revising the definition of terrorist act, and you can see it online on our website if you're interested. But there have been, I think, significant incursions into some of the protections that we as a community have enjoyed, and we would like to see more robust protections across a whole range of areas. And I think, unfortunately, the experience that we've all had over the last 2.5+ years has meant that we actually have a lot of case studies that will guide us in terms of asking for practical reform.
Thanks, Simone. That's really interesting to hear what the community is hoping for. Dean, based on your experience in policy and lawmaking, can you explore the anticipated outcomes from a policy perspective? How you see that the findings of the Royal Commission will then end up influencing policy, government decision-making, legislation?
Yeah, well, it's a good question because obviously we don't know exactly how the Royal Commission will unfold. So far, what we've seen is, at least publicly, the Commissioner's opening statement, which was made publicly, which I thought was very, very positive, and there was some strong maybe guardrails or parameters that she set, that some people, for example, there was debate over whether she would use the IRA definition, and she reaffirmed that she would straight away. So I think that was positive, and I thought she explained it really well, actually. Probably better than many of us have been able to, why she thought it was a good definition. But as I say, the government's outsourced this now, so it's fully within the responsibility of the commissioner and her staff and her councils assisting. So we will have to wait and see. I think certainly right now there's a strong appetite in the government to repair relations with the community, and we've seen, I think, some positive steps of healing from probably the announcement of the Royal Commission through to the 1 month on ceremony at the Opera House, and some of the actions since the legislation that was passed. As Simone said, some of the aspects of that didn't get through. There wasn't consensus on a bipartisan or cross-party basis. But I suppose that there's a range of different processes, just worth saying. It's not all in the hands of the Royal Commission. We've had some of the legislative change already around serious anti-vilification, the listing of groups that didn't previously meet the threshold to be prescribed groups, which was specifically designed to target, in this case, Hizb ut-Tahrir and the National Socialist Network. So these processes are going on. I saw one of the Q&A questions asked about the Education Task Force. That's a separate task force. There's also the recommendations that the Special Envoy, Gillian Siegel's made, which the government's working through implementing. So it's not a sit and wait, but I think that there'll obviously be strong interest, and the shorter time frame is, in a sense, a shame because it will force the commissioner and the commission to be, I suppose, more efficient and more selecting in the things that it's able to both find and recommend between now and the end of this year, or the end of November, when the final report's due. But it also does mean that the momentum will continue, and things won't necessarily fall away as quickly. And from a political perspective, the news doesn't stop, does it? And I'm sure that we'll continue to see issues in the community here as the war with Iran intensifies as well. So there's a lot of work ongoing, but I certainly think that you'll see when the final report comes out, the government will want to show that it's taking the findings and the recommendations seriously and working through them as quickly as possible, because they won't want to be taken back to where they were accused previously of dragging their feet or not taking strong enough action or leadership. And I think that we're seeing, as I said, especially since the end of last year, post Bondi, some of the signs that they really want to rectify that.
Thanks, Dean. Look, we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A and only a short amount of time left. So I think we might start straight to the questions. The first question is actually one that was submitted previously, and I think perhaps Jeremie, if you'd be able to answer this. As much as this Royal Commission appears to be a positive outcome, where precisely is the accountability of the Commissioner of Government, and how can we trust that the process will actually be worth people's time to submit to the Royal Commission?
Well, I'll give two parts response to that question. From a legal perspective, the Commission is bound by the terms of reference, by the letters patent, and therefore the report has to be made public. And that final report is tabled in Parliament, and that does create political scrutiny. Now, findings are always, like every other Royal Commission we've seen in this country, subject to the media, civil society, and community scrutiny. And of course, the hearings are conducted in a way that are constrained by procedural fairness and legal limits, like Virginia Bell has already made the point of, without prejudicing the trial against the alleged Bondi attacker. So, a Royal Commission recommends, it doesn't implement. And that's one of the limitations that we just have to make the point very clearly of from the outset. Indigenous Australians know this extremely well from deaths in custody and the Bringing Them Home report. Royal Commissions can make incredible and important and nuanced recommendations, but if they're not implemented, then in some ways they fall short of the lofty goals that they capture. And I think that that's something that we should be mindful of. Why trust the process? So I think what Simone said earlier was a really important point about not being intimidated by the word submission and thinking of it more along the lines of storytelling. And so that was the second part of my response, is about saying this. Royal Commissions are a vehicle, a really important one, to shape law, policy, and funding priorities, even if they're imperfect and even if they might collect dust in some of their recommendations. It's really behooves us as members of the Jewish community and members of the sensible centre, Jewish or non-Jewish, to make a contribution, because there are very few forums like this where individual lived experience can actually inform and influence national policy at scale. So, of course, there's no guarantee recommendations will be implemented, but silence almost guarantees invisibility. So if you have an experience, please make a submission in bullet point form. Use the resources available to you that have been put by the Jewish Independent in the link, and make your contribution and your voice heard.
Been a couple of questions that have talked about media, either social media or what some people would call legacy media. Simone, perhaps if you could answer whether you think the Royal Commission will be able to address the social media in particular, which you did touch on in your earlier answer, and the difficulties of dealing with social media in the context of the Commission.
Yeah, I mean, social media is an issue that I think Jewish communities around the world are navigating. To give you an example, many of the mainstream organizations have had to turn comments off on their different pages because, unfortunately, it is a cesspool of anti-Semitic discourse. Now, one of the things that we've learned is that despite there being, in some cases, quite far-reaching policies in place by some of the platforms, and despite the fact that they've made significant investments in AI, for whatever reason, they are not removing even a fraction of the anti-Semitic content that is online. And I think that this is the kind of thing that a recommendation could address. We've already seen legislative change. So, for example, the social media ban for under 16s. We know that even though there are obviously always workarounds and cracks in these sorts of reforms, there are ways to address these issues. And similarly, regulation of AI, we've seen that in some US jurisdictions. So in some states in the US, there has been introduction of regulation in this area. So it's possible. And again, if you don't share your experiences, and I just want to thank everyone on this panel for kind of their positive outlook on this, because this is really a once in a generation, I think, potentially more opportunity for our community. And unfortunately, as has been said, this has come at great personal expense to the Jewish community. And, it's really important that we take this opportunity and we advocate strongly for ourselves, and that we're courageous in how we do that and ambitious, and that there are protections available. I think a lot of people think that they will be called upon to give evidence if they make a submission. It's incredibly unlikely in such a short time frame and with such a focused commission. It is incredibly unlikely that individuals who make submissions will be called upon to give evidence. And furthermore, of course, you can make an anonymous or a confidential submission. So, many people that I've seen since I joined ECAJ have been targeted online, on social media, and in other ways as well. And that has often transferred into the real world. And people have a vast array of screenshots and evidence of this kind of conduct. There's absolutely nothing to stop you submitting that evidence to the Royal Commission. Similarly, don't assume that just because something's in the public domain, the Royal Commission will see it. If something has happened that has had direct impact on you, you should definitely tell the Royal Commission about it. I know that people have reservations and understandably some cynicism about what can be achieved. But as was said before, if no one does anything, nothing will be achieved. And this is really an opportunity for us to come together and share our experiences. And the one thing I can really say from having looked at, the vast body, unfortunately, of anti-Semitic incidents, because the ECAJ produces every year the annual anti-Semitism report, which is relied upon by government, and contains detailed data about anti-Semitic incidents and trends in discourse as well, is that when you look at that, you see clear patterns and trends. So, for example, the use of particular slogans and phrases, particular types of conduct that are becoming more prevalent. And the thing is that information is valuable, because if there are many submissions that all point in the same direction, then that will help inform the Commission in terms of its thinking about what action it might take. So yeah, I can't emphasize it enough. Please make a submission.
Could I jump in on that, if I may, and just to echo that approach, and to say this: even if you've not been the target of a specific incident, right? You don't need to have been doxxed. You don't need to have been a member of the East Melbourne Synagogue. You don't need to have been sitting at the Miznon when it was assaulted. Your lived experience is valuable. And there was someone in the chat that made a comment about the experience of wearing a kippah, or my experience as a father of children, as many of you, I'm sure, of going to Jewish daycare and having to go through security guards and barricades, and the sense of panic that we feel when we hear certain phrases. It is really cannot be stressed enough that lived experience is worthy of a submission. I really think that there is a great value in considering taking 35 minutes, 40 minutes, and making your voice heard.
Thanks, Jeremie and Simone, for your answers to that question. There have been a number of questions asking about the interrelationship between the Royal Commission and some of the other inquiries and reports that have been prepared over the last few years. Obviously, we've got the Siegel report, we've got the parliamentary inquiry into the universities, we've got the education inquiry that's happening at the moment. Jeremie, whether or not you or Simone or Dean want to answer this, but how will these all relate and be dealt with by the Royal Commission? Some of which are reports that have already been handed down, and some which are ongoing reports or inquiries.
Well, I think Well, I think I touched on earlier that there are a range of different reports and processes going on. So I think, and um, I'm probably the only person here who's not a lawyer, so the only law school dropout anyway. But I think the Royal Commission will obviously have the power to consider all of these things, and I'm sure, for example, the Special Envoy will give evidence, make submissions, be a key witness and expert that they'll rely on. But everything, the Royal Commission's findings and recommendations will all be ultimately determined by the Commissioner, not by anyone else. So they're not bound to, advance things that come from other reports or recommendations, but certainly they will, I'm sure, consider all of that and come up with their own recommendations. But as I say, this is not the only thing that the government will consider. The government will have to, as it's already committed to, work through other commitments that it's made, and certainly the discussion about the serious vilification offence that Simone raised earlier is still an ongoing one. If they can get that through the Senate, if they can get the support of the opposition or the crossbench, as it were, and then implementing the recommendations of the Segal report, for example, that they've committed to doing, and things like the education task force are something that they've already commenced, and they'll get recommendations from that, and they'll go about implementing them. So these are all parallel connected things. The Royal Commission is the big one, and it's the one that every member of the community and indeed every member of the public has a right to make a submission to. And I've seen a lot of questions asking, should I put this forward? Can I put this forward? Yes. The answer is probably always yes. If it's not relevant, that's fine. Let the commission determine that. But if you have an experience to share, if you have a story to tell, or just something that you think needs to be heard, then you should absolutely put it forward.
Thanks, Dean.
And
I was going to say,
can I
Simone, did you
just,
want to add to that? Yes.
yeah, I just want to give an example that I hope, builds on what Dean has just said and helps people understand how these things work. So in 2021, the ECAJ made a submission on another inquiry into extremism, and it's on our website if you're interested. It was a very detailed submission, and in it, my boss, Peter Wertheim, recommended a two-tiered listing approach with what have now become called prohibited hate organizations. So this was something that was put forward in 2021. At the time, it just didn't get traction. But the thing is that if there's one thing that our community and also many other minority communities know, we're in this for the long game in terms of seeking reform. Things don't happen overnight. And unfortunately, I mean, we would love to have been able to avoid taking people on this journey. Certainly, all of us, I'm sure, and many others have warned repeatedly about the risks in an environment of escalating anti-Semitism. But for many people, including government, including opposition, they didn't necessarily see perhaps the urgency to implement these reforms in quite the same way that we as a community did. If you look at that inquiry at the time and you look at what's now happened with the, prohibited hate organizations. And that's actually been a really significant development that's happened in the last few months. We've seen the National Socialist Network shut down, Hizb ut-Tahrir shut down, and there will be other organizations as well who will ultimately cease to operate in Australia. And that will be a great step forward, because we know that those organizations have been promoting hatred, they've been recruiting members, and that they've been raising funds as well, and indoctrinating and radicalizing people. So basically, even if you have made a submission to one of these other inquiries, and many of you made great submissions to the university inquiry that took place before the Senate and then again before the Parliament, don't assume, as I said before, that your submission will necessarily be seen. Feel free even to recycle it. There's absolutely no harm. There were some excellent submissions that were made to the Senate inquiry into anti-Semitism at universities where people described their lived experiences on campus. If you've gone to the trouble to do that already and you were dissatisfied with the outcome at the time, then just share your submission again. So there's a wealth of material that we already have at our fingertips, and I think that it would do us some good to share that information with the Commission.
Thanks, Simone. Jeremie, did you have anything to add in relation to that question about the interrelation with the other inquiries?
Not in the same way. I guess one of my real hopes is that because it is a royal commission and it's being headed by, a judge, it has the truth-telling capacity and power to perhaps cut through some of the bias and overreach that perhaps we in the Jewish community have some strategically perhaps fallen victim to a little bit. So what I mean to say is that I hope that the recommendations are also incredibly carefully drawn, and I assume they will be, because I think that when the community, even though it has very good reason to feel victimized and cautious, makes recommendations that are overly prescriptive of regulating political expression or, try to embed disciplinary frameworks within campuses or, cutting funding. I think that a lot of the overreach in some ways has not necessarily been the most mobilizing vehicle to actually seeing institutional reform and the prevention that we're looking at. And so I do think that the Commission has the opportunity to do perhaps what some of the inquiries and Gillian Siegel's report didn't do before, and that is to calibrate and to be more measured.
Thank you, Jeremie. We've only got a few minutes left. So perhaps if I could ask each of you if you could just make a 1-minute final statement about some of the things that you consider would come out of this panel, starting with you, Jeremie, seeing you had the floor a minute ago.
I think I've spoken extensively, so I'm actually going to forfeit that minute. I feel I'd like to give it to my co-panelists to share their thoughts. I
Very
feel
generous of you,
yeah,
Dean.
my voice has been adequately heard.
Yeah, look, I think I think just the biggest thing, as we've all said, and we can only keep saying, is people should engage with the process. If you have something to share, if I could maybe add one more thing that I discussed with one of the organizations that I've been helping in this space about is also, if you have positive stories to tell, don't be afraid to tell those too. If something's happened to you that you consider to be anti-Semitic, that upset you, and actually people responded in a positive way, whether it's your workplace, whether it's an organization that you're a part of, share that too, because I think it's important that the Royal Commission doesn't just consider what's gone wrong, but also what's gone right, and what are the best practice models that they can follow and recommend for others to follow. So, but as I say, it's an important process, and there's a lot of attention on at the moment, and it is important. I think, as Jeremie said, it's probably for all of us to reflect on the best ways to convince others to listen to us and to follow what we're doing. But through the confines of this, it's a really serious process. It's being chaired by a retired judge of very eminent status, and it's independent of government. So once the report is handed down, it'll be on the community and the public to continue to hold the government to account in implementing it. But for the moment now, yeah, this is an independent process, and everyone has the right to have a say. So have it.
Thanks, Dean. And Simone, parting comments?
Yeah, I really endorse that. I think it's so important that people tell their authentic truth, positive, negative, etc. And just think about, what might move a decision maker. So, even if you haven't been a victim of discrimination, or you can't demonstrate through evidence that you've been targeted because of your Jewish ethnicity, even if it's just describing the deafening silence after October 7 in your workplace, nobody reaching out to you, whatever it is that happened to you, or not being invited to the union meeting, or whatever it is, just tell your story. And I would say as well, do it constructively. don't engage, if you can, in too much far reach or trying to think about what the systemic reform might look like that would fix that problem, because I think, that's really where the brains of the Commission will come in. But just tell the Commission about your experience, so that they understand what this looks and feels like in our society.
Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, to Simone, Dean, and Jeremie, for what has been a really interesting evening. I think that the people who have been online would have all learned something and encouraged to make a submission about their lived experience. And I think we're all watching with bated breath to see the outcome of the Commission, and I'm sure we'll be gathering in similar forums in the future to discuss that. So thank you again, all of you who joined us, and thank you for our panellists and to the Jewish Independent for organising what has been a really interesting evening. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you very much.